A Pentium 4 motherboard with ISA slots for those DOS ISA sound cards. Well, I'm excited. I'm not sure what to expect. I do have high hopes, so let's take a closer look. In the box was the motherboard. It came with 512 megabytes of RAM, a Pentium 4 2.4. We have an IDE ribbon cable, a driver disk, and an I/O shield. Socket 478, we have 2 DDR slots. Here goes the ATX power supply, floppy port, 2 IDE ports, AGP, 2 PCI, and 3 ISA slots. At the back we have 2 PS2, serial, VGA out, parallel, 4 USB 2 ports, Ethernet, and audio. I removed the Intel chipset cooler, and underneath I found the Intel 845GL. I found this document from Intel which compares some of the Intel 845 chipset versions. So we have the 845GL and it mentions 400 MHz only. So that seems to be the reason why the 533 MHz jumper doesn't seem to work. But surprisingly, it also mentions down here no AGP card or signal support. However, I was able to get an AGP card working just fine, so I'm a little bit confused as to what is going on here. This is Intel's I/O controller hub version 4. There are 2 chips from Realtek. This one here is for Ethernet, and there's another one over here for sound. These 2 chips here from Winbond make the ISA slots possible. In this data sheet, it mentions that these 2 chips together form a complete set for the PCI to ISA bridge, and it mentions here interrupt and DMA control. There are also a few headers and jumpers on this motherboard. So the front panel header is here. We have a pin out diagram over there. This jumper is for clearing the CMOS. Then we've got a second serial port header over there. Another header here for infrared, together with a jumper to enable or disable this feature. Audio port here, CD in over there. And then up here we have an interesting jumper. This sets the FSB between 400 and 533, but this chipset only supports 400 megahertz FSB. And we also have a USB header just about here. Well, I guess it's time to fire it up and see what it can do. Here we are in the BIOS. The chip has a date from 2022, award BIOS, and we have plenty of options to play around with. As always, I like to disable resources that I'm not using. For example, the USB ports as well as the serial and parallel ports. For this project, I'm using PS2 input devices. I will be testing 3 operating systems in this video. We're going to start with Windows XP, then we're going to transition to Windows 98, and finally MS-DOS, because, well, I see this mainboard being very suitable for a multi-operating system retro PC. Here I'm installing Windows XP. I'm using a 500 GB SSD together with a StarTech SATA to ID adapter. I'm using the easy to boot project which lets you install Windows XP from a USB thumb drive. And here we are on the desktop. We can see the colors are really messed up. So next I'm hooking up a USB hard drive, and I'm using the Snappy Driver Installer Origin project, which has a driver database and it probes the system and then recommends drivers to install. I'm choosing all the options, and after a reboot we now have the video drivers working, sound, and everything else. I ran 3D Mark 2001 SE and we're getting a score of 1286 with the integrated graphics. Well, the Intel Extreme graphics is not that extreme. Let's go with something more powerful. This is the GeForce 4 MX 440. The GeForce 4 MX gets detected right away. We can see the BIOS splash screen. Now, the BIOS does have an option to disable the onboard graphics, but that doesn't seem to work. It still appears in Device Manager, but you can just right-click and disable it. So I ran the 3D Mark again, and we're now getting a score of 4233. Let's try out a game. Here we have Screamer 4x4, which is a fun off-road racing game. We're running a 1024x768 with the OpenGL API, and the game runs just fine. And now things are getting interesting. Let's test Windows 98 and MS-DOS. Off we go. After partitioning, formatting, and making bootable a SD card together with an SD to ID adapter, I then copy the Windows 98 setup files and running the setup. And here we have Windows 98. The installation worked fine, no hangs or any other issues. The drivers come next, so I'm using the drivers from the disk with the chipset drivers first, followed by the Intel graphics drivers for Windows 98. It's fully supported, and then the Realtek network drivers and audio drivers. I couldn't find the right driver package for the Realtek onboard chip. I used a random driver from the disk. They installed, but I'm getting a few issues, for example, in Screamer 4x4 and Tomb Raider 2. The audio sounds a little bit messed up. I'm sure a different driver will fix this, but for Windows 98, if you're serious about gaming, just use a PCI sound card like a Sound Blaster Live, Audigy, or Aural Vortex 2. And now to the interesting part of this video, the ISA slots and compatibility with ISA sound cards. We're starting the investigation with the Creative Labs AWE64. I disabled the onboard audio in the BIOS, and now with the Sound Blaster AWE64 in the system, Windows 98 detects the card right away and installs the drivers. But after a reboot, unfortunately, I can see that the speaker icon is missing. That usually tells me that there's something not working with the drivers. So I go into the device manager and I can see there's an issue with the interrupt. Apparently interrupt 5 that the system is trying to use is already in use. So I set that manually to use interrupt 7, and after reboot we are now getting some sound. But that's not the end with the issues. The DirectX sound test also throws an error. So at this point I'm moving on. I want to try some DOS games first. So I'm opening the DOS prompt and I'm trying Doom. We're getting FM music, but unfortunately no Sound Blaster sound. Well, at this point I thought this is a huge disaster, but it turns out you can go into the BIOS options. There is a setting for plug and play, and here you can allocate some resources to legacy ISA. So I did just that, reserving the interrupt 7 as well as DMA 1 and 5. And after I reboot, look at that, the DirectX sound test is now working, and here we have Doom, and yes, working sound effects. Awesome. So DOS prompt is working. Let's try out MS-DOS mode, which we reboot into. And the first thing I'm seeing, I'm getting an EMM386 error. I tried a few workarounds. You can add an M4 parameter at the end. It sort of worked. TIE Fighter, for example, wasn't working without EMS and is now working. But yeah, this is something I wasn't able to fully solve. If you know a workaround, do let me know. But now let's test a few games. I've done some recordings. Let's check it out.
Into the wonderful The rebels are unprepared for our attack. Signal Vice Admiral Thrawn to launch his TIE squadrons immediately.
With the Sound Blaster emulation project out and about, you might be wondering, well, what's the point of going with an ISA motherboard? We can just use the Sound Blaster emulator. Well, what happens if you slow down the processor by disabling the CPU cache? Then Sound Blaster emulator doesn't work anymore, whereas this one has no problems at all. So you can go into the BIOS, turn off the level 1 CPU cache. Here's a 3D benchmark result. We're getting a score of 18, so that's an entry level for 86SX, and many speed sensitive games will now work. Here we have a demonstration, Space Quest 1, the VGA version. I wanted to try out a few more sound cards to see if they're also compatible. So next up is the Yamaha YMF, and I'm using the Unisound drivers.
Zero, zero, zero.
So the Yamaha YMF worked just fine. What about this one? It is the legendary ESS audio drive.
Zero, zero, zero.
And the ESS audio drive also worked just fine for me. So let's wrap up this video. All in all, there is a lot to like. I like that you can build a multi-operating system machine with Windows XP, Windows 98, and MS-DOS. So a ton of games will work just fine. We have enough performance to run some of the more demanding games, but of course it's not as fast as an F164 or one of the more high-end Pentium 4s. We have legacy interfaces from the serial port, the parallel port, we have the IDE interface, the floppy ports, and so on. And of course, the highlight, the ISA slots. We also have modern conveniences. So we have USB ports. It's an ATX form factor with an ATX power connector. So it's very nice to put this in a modern case and build a retro time machine. The BIOS is nice with plenty of options, and you do need to configure the plug-and-play resources to get full compatibility with the ISA sound cards. Talking about compatibility, apart from the Prince of Persia issue, I didn't have any dramas. All the games I tried worked just fine, Adlib and Sound Blaster, so yeah, that was really good to see. The issue with the expanded memory and the EMM386 memory manager, well, that is unfortunate. If you know a workaround, please leave any tips down below in the comments. Maybe there's an easy solution that we can apply. There is a lot to like, but it's not perfect, and considering the price, well, you're looking at around $200 to $300. That is a steep price, and for that sort of price you can get a motherboard bundle with a Socket 7, a Pentium MMX, which will be even more compatible, and in my opinion, maybe a better purchase. But what do you think? That's what it boils down to. These are just my thoughts. What is your opinion? Looking forward to hearing your thoughts down below in the comments. Every Saturday, a reason for me to get out early, off to the coffee shop, reading and answering your comments. That's what this is all about. So yeah, I hope you found it interesting. If you were sitting on the fence of getting one of these, maybe now you know a little bit more and you can make a decision. If you do have one of these, please share your experiences. I would love to hear from you. And that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you soon with another one.